Picture this. You're about to give the most important speech of your career. The spotlight is on you. The cameras are rolling, and people start leaving the room. One by one, row by row, world leaders, diplomats, and officials just get up and walk out. Brutal, right? Most of us would break into a cold sweat, maybe stutter, maybe even run after them like, "Wait, don't go. I promise it gets better." But Benjamin Netanyahu, he didn't flinch. He stood tall, chest out, and delivered his speech like he'd planned the whole walkout. Now, let's be honest. On the surface, this looked embarrassing. Imagine performing stand-up comedy and the front row just leaves before you even hit your punchline. Ouch. But here's the twist. Netanyahu knew this would happen, and he wanted it to happen. Why? Because in politics, sometimes an empty room is louder than a full one. See, when those diplomats walked out, it created the perfect stage for his favorite act, defiance. He wasn't there to win applause from Europeans or impress leaders already furious about the Gaza war. No. This was theater, a performance designed to beam back home to Israeli voters. Think of it like reality TV. When your rivals storm off, you don't chase them. You smirk, sip your coffee, and let the camera zoom in. And Netanyahu loves that zoom-in moment. He wanted the optics of being the guy who stood alone against a hostile world. To his supporters, that's not weakness, it's heroism. He can now point to the walkouts and say, "See, everyone's against us, but I stood strong." It's the political version of, haters gonna hate, but I'm still standing. Now, let me ask you, if you were a leader and the entire world was giving you the cold shoulder, would you take that as a signal to compromise? Or would you double down, play the tough guy, and make it your brand? Netanyahu clearly chose the second option because he knows something about human psychology. When people feel cornered, they rally around the one person who looks unshaken. And that's exactly the image he projected. Stoic, unbothered, defiant. Here's the kicker. Outside Israel, this played as isolation. Inside Israel, it played as strength. The domestic narrative is everything. The more he looks attacked abroad, the more he looks like a protector at home. And with elections always lurking around the corner, this wasn't just a UN speech. It was a campaign rally disguised as global diplomacy. So the crowd's gone, the room is half empty, but guess what? The mic is still on. And if you think a few walkouts would shut Netanyahu up, oh, you're in for a treat. Because next, he cranked the volume to a level no one expected. Literally. Okay, imagine you're chilling at home, scrolling on your phone, maybe watching cat videos or memes, and suddenly, bam, Netanyahu's UN speech starts blasting on your device. No YouTube ad, no skip button, just full-on political lecture mode. Sounds crazy, right? Well, that's exactly what Israel claimed it pulled off in Gaza. Here's what went down. Netanyahu's team set up giant loudspeakers on trucks parked along the Gaza border to literally blast his UN speech straight into Palestinian neighborhoods. Forget subtle diplomacy, this was like dropping a mixtape at full volume in the middle of a war zone. Imagine trying to cook dinner while a foreign prime minister is yelling about global politics through megaphones outside your window. Creepy, intimidating, both. But they didn't stop there. Israeli officials went one step further and claimed they hijacked Gazans' phones, injecting Netanyahu's speech into their calls, their devices, their feeds. Basically, if you tried to check WhatsApp, you risked hearing Netanyahu instead of your cousin. Now, did this actually work? Some sources on the ground said, nope, never heard it. Others weren't so sure, but let's pause and think. Even the threat of it is chilling. It says, we can reach you anywhere, anytime, even in your pocket. That's not just broadcasting, that's psychological warfare. And you have to admit, it's audacious. Who needs CNN or BBC when you can beam your speech directly into your enemy's phone? This wasn't just about words, it was about showing power.
The message wasn't subtle. We're in control. Even your silence isn't safe from us. Now, let's bring it back to politics. Why would Netanyahu risk such a bizarre move? Because, again, it's all about image. For Israeli voters, this looks like strength, creativity, dominance. He can say, look, I'm not just speaking to the UN, I'm speaking to Gaza itself. I'm not hiding in New York, I'm projecting power back home. And for his base, that's gold. It paints him as the only leader willing to go that far to send a message. But let me ask you, how far is too far? At what point does projecting strength cross into paranoia? Is hijacking phones leadership, or is it desperation dressed as innovation? These are the uncomfortable questions swirling around this stunt, because while some Israelis may cheer it, others may wonder, are we crossing lines that only make the conflict deeper? And here's the irony. While the world debated whether the phone hijack even happened, Netanyahu didn't care. The point wasn't whether Gazans actually heard it. The point was that Israelis heard he tried. And in politics, sometimes the attempt matters more than the outcome. So first, the walkouts gave him an empty stage. Then the loudspeakers made sure no one could escape his voice, but Netanyahu not done. Oh no. Next, he brings out props, maps, and even QR codes, turning the UN into something between a game show and a lecture hall. You're not ready for this one.
Okay, let's be real. Most UN speeches, snooze fests. Long paragraphs, boring diplomatic jargon, polite claps, and maybe one or two people nodding off in the back row. But Netanyahu? He decided, nope, not today. If I'm going down in history, I'm going down with props. Yes, props. Actual visual aids. The man basically turned the UN into his own political TED Talk. First up, he whips out a giant map labeled The Curse. Sounds dramatic, right? Like something out of a horror movie. And in a way it was. This wasn't your average geography lesson. He had countries marked like a battlefield scoreboard, pointing to places where Israel had allegedly neutralized threats. Now think about that. In a chamber full of diplomats, he basically put up a giant gotcha board and declared, here's where we took out your guys. Subtle? Absolutely not. Effective for headlines back home? Oh, 100%. Then came the next level gimmick, a QR code pin on his suit. That's right. While everyone else is rocking plain ties and stiff jackets, Netanyahu comes in with a scannable code on his chest. Scan it, and boom, it links you to Israel's version of October 7th, complete with carefully crafted messaging. It's like saying, why wait for the press? I'll put my propaganda in your pocket. But the piece de resistance? The multiple choice quiz placard. Yes, you heard that right. He literally held up a sign with a question like it was Jeopardy. Who's responsible for the chaos? And the options? Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and of course, the kicker, all of the above. Spoiler alert, he picked option D. Now ask yourself, why all the theatrics? Why the maps, the pins, the props? Because visuals stick. Words vanish, but a big red map, that lives rent-free in people's minds. A QR code? That spreads like wildfire online. Netanyahu knows he's not just talking to diplomats, he's creating viral moments. And in the age of memes, that's priceless. But here's the other layer. Back home in Israel, these props signal something deeper. They tell voters, look, I'm not just giving speeches, I'm showing receipts. It's proof of action, even if simplified. For supporters, it screams strength. For critics, it screams desperation. But either way, people are talking. So let me toss this back to you. Do you think these gimmicks make him look strong, or do they make him look like a desperate professor trying too hard to get attention in class? Because the fine line between genius and cringe is very, very thin. And while the props might have amused or annoyed the international audience, for Israelis watching the live coverage, it landed differently. He turned global pressure into a stage for showmanship. And that's where he thrives. All right. Props are flashy, QR codes are clever, but speeches aren't just about gadgets. At some point, you gotta drop the hammer. And oh boy, Netanyahu did just that by doubling down on the war itself. This wasn't diplomacy, it was a warning shot. Let's cut to the chase. Netanyahu didn't just show up at the UN to wave maps and play tech-savvy. No, he came to deliver an ultimatum. 3 words. Finish the job. Now, what does that mean? In his own words, it meant one thing: Gaza isn't done. The war, already dragging on for years, isn't over until Hamas is crushed, every hostage is released, and Israel can claim total victory. Sounds clear, but here's the catch. Total victory is a moving target, and Netanyahu knows it. Think about it. When leaders use phrases like finish the job, what they're really saying is, don't expect me to back down anytime soon. It's a promise to his supporters and a threat to his enemies. And he delivered it with classic Netanyahu flair, painting the war not just as Israel's battle, but civilization's battle. To him, every critic was weak, every nation recognizing Palestine was complicit, and every delay in war was dangerous. He even went nuclear with analogies, comparing recognition of a Palestinian state after October 7th to giving al-Qaeda a state next to New York after 9/11. Think about that imagery. New York, 9/11, terrorism at the doorstep. He didn't just tug emotional strings, he yanked them like a guitar solo. But let's pause here. Ask yourself, is this leadership or is this fear-mongering? When you frame your opponents as existential threats, it rallies your base. It creates unity through fear. And Netanyahu is betting hard that this works in Israel, even if the world thinks it's extreme. Now, internationally, this didn't go over well. Leaders in Europe, even some in the US, were already fed up. They want the war wound down, the hostages freed, and some roadmap to peace. But Netanyahu, he's not giving an inch. He made it clear. Any push for Palestinian statehood is madness, suicide, betrayal. And if you oppose him, well, you're siding with anti-Semitic mobs, as he bluntly put it. Subtlety has left the building. Domestically, though, this is where it hits hard. His supporters eat this up. They see him as the last man standing between Israel and chaos. They don't hear isolation, they hear protection. They don't hear stubbornness, they hear strength. And in politics, perception is everything. But here's the million-dollar question. How sustainable is this? Can you really keep saying finish the job without ever finishing it? At what point do voters start asking, okay, but where's the finish line? That's the danger of ultimatums. They sound powerful in the moment, but they can backfire if the reality doesn't match the promise. Still, in the context of this UN speech, Netanyahu wasn't there to promise peace, he was there to promise fight. And whether you love him or hate him, he delivered that promise loud and clear. So, he's faced the walkouts, blasted Gaza with loudspeakers, waved his props, and doubled down on the war. But here's the twist. You might think this was all about the world stage. Spoiler, the real audience wasn't in New York at all. It was back home in Israel. And that takes us to the heart of his entire strategy.
Okay, let's get something straight. If you thought this whole UN show was aimed at diplomats sipping lattes in the lounge, you've missed the plot. The real audience for Netanyahu's speech wasn't in New York, it was at home in Israel. That's right, every prop, every fiery line, every dramatic pause was less about foreign policy and more about domestic politics. Think about it. You're an Israeli voter. You've watched 2 years of war. Your economy is shaky, your kids are nervous about the future, and the world feels like it's closing in on your country. Then you see your prime minister standing at the UN, shrugging off walkouts, calling out world leaders, blasting Gaza with his speech, literally, and holding up props like a battle plan. Do you see a man isolated, or do you see a warrior refusing to back down? For his base, the answer is clear. He's the fighter-in-chief. Here's the thing. Netanyahu has built his career on one narrative. Only I can protect you. That's his brand. And this UN speech was a brand commercial, a 40-minute political ad disguised as global diplomacy. When he railed against countries recognizing Palestine, when he mocked leaders for being weak-kneed, when he compared Palestinian statehood to national suicide, he wasn't trying to win over France or Canada. He was telling Israelis, they're all against us, but I'll never cave. And you know what? That works. Why? Because fear is a powerful motivator, and unity under siege is a real phenomenon. If the world looks like it's abandoning you, you cling tighter to the leader who promises never to abandon you back. That's why every walkout, every protest, every headline condemning Israel is actually fuel for Netanyahu's domestic fire. He can turn to voters and say, see, I told you, everyone wants us weak, but I won't bend. But let me throw a question at you. How long can this strategy last? How many times can you run the "only I can save you" play before people ask, save us from what and when? Because if the war drags on without clear victory, if the economy suffers, if international isolation grows, at some point voters might decide the defiance isn't protecting them, it's trapping them. Still, in the short term, this UN speech nailed its goal. It wasn't a plea for international sympathy, it was a rallying cry for domestic loyalty. And that's the magic of Netanyahu's style. He knows how to flip weakness into strength, isolation into defiance, and global criticism into national unity. But wait, we're not done yet. Because if you think Netanyahu's speech was only about props, threats, and applause back home, there's one more layer, the bigger picture. And that's where we hit the real analysis, what this speech means for Israel, the world, and the future. So let's zoom out. We've broken down the walkouts, the loudspeakers, the props, the ultimatums, and the domestic rally cries. But what does it all add up to? What's the takeaway? Let's dive deep. Netanyahu's UN speech was not just another speech, it was a blueprint for how he plans to survive politically. Internationally, he's cornered. Countries are recognizing Palestine, sanctions, embargoes, and protests are piling up. Israel is more isolated than it's been in decades. If you were writing a traditional diplomatic strategy, you'd say, time to soften up, mend ties, find compromise. But Netanyahu, he flipped the script. He's saying, forget the world, I'll double down at home. And here's the genius, or the gamble, depending on how you see it. By ignoring international pressure and focusing entirely on domestic perception, he's basically betting the farm on one idea. Israelis will reward defiance more than conciliation. That's risky, but historically it's worked for him. Every time global backlash rises, his poll numbers at home often stay steady, or even climb. Why? Because he reframes isolation as proof of his strength. But here's the dark side. What happens if the war drags on? What happens if hostages don't come home? What happens if the economy sinks under tariffs, boycotts, and sanctions? At some point, even the strongest branding campaign can't mask real pain. Israelis might start asking, is his defiance saving us or costing us? Now, let's throw in the Trump factor. Netanyahu clearly leaned into his bond with Trump, his closest ally in this messy game. But Trump isn't exactly patient, and his recent remarks made it clear he wants the Gaza war to end. If Trump pushes harder, Netanyahu could find himself stuck, end the war and risk losing his right-wing base, or keep fighting and risk losing his biggest ally. That's a no-win scenario. And internationally, this speech made one thing crystal clear. The gap between Israel and much of the world is widening. Leaders who once stood with Israel are now walking out literally. Recognition of Palestinian statehood is spreading, and Netanyahu's fiery defiance only accelerates that divide. It's politics at home, but it's isolation abroad. So here's the question for all of us. Does this kind of defiance make Israel safer or more vulnerable? Does it buy time or does it burn bridges? And most importantly, how long can a leader survive on speeches, maps, and loudspeakers before reality knocks on the door? Because here's the truth. Netanyahu's UN speech wasn't about peace. It wasn't even about diplomacy. It was about survival. Political survival at home, narrative survival abroad, and legacy survival in history books. So, as the applause fades, as the protests roar, and as the loudspeakers go silent, one question lingers. When the theatrics end, what's left? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Is Netanyahu playing 4D chess or just stalling for time? And if you want more deep dives into the global stage, hit subscribe, ring the bell, and stay tuned, because this story, it's far from over.
Sometimes the loudest part of a speech isn't what you say, it's what you leave out. And in Netanyahu's case, the omissions were just as revealing as the theatrics. Let's unpack what he didn't say, because trust me, the silence is deafening. First off, the West Bank. You'd expect Netanyahu, backed by a coalition of right-wing partners, to double down on annexation talk, right? Especially since many in his government are screaming for it. But nope, not a word about annexing the West Bank. Zero, nada, zilch. Why? Because guess who stepped in? Trump. Just a day before Netanyahu's big UN moment, Trump flatly told the press he would not allow Israel to annex the West Bank. Boom. That's not just a policy line, that's a leash. So Netanyahu skipped it. No promises, no hints, no red meat for his far-right partners. For a guy who thrives on defiance, this silence was suspiciously compliant. Next, ending the Gaza war. Not a single sentence about wrapping it up, no timelines, no roadmaps, not even vague promises of peace. Why? Because the war is his political shield. The longer it lasts, the longer he can play the strong man under siege. The moment it ends, elections loom, accountability knocks, and voters might actually start measuring results instead of rhetoric. So silence, strategy. And here's where it gets really interesting. His speech was supposed to be global, yet he didn't even attempt olive branches, no nods to reconciliation, no crumbs for allies who are furious with him. He left out any recognition of international pressure, sanctions, or Israel's growing isolation. Why? Because admitting it would weaken the narrative back home. His silence lets him pretend those problems don't exist. Out of speech, out of mind. Now let's flip the perspective. What does this mean for Israelis watching at home? Some might see it as smart. Why give fuel to enemies? Why show weakness? But others might ask, why isn't he talking about the end game? Why isn't he addressing the West Bank? Why is he pretending international backlash doesn't matter? The silence could backfire. After all, leadership isn't just about what you shout, it's also about what you can't avoid saying. So let me throw this question at you. When leaders skip the hard topics, do you feel reassured or do you feel they're hiding something? Is silence strength or is it fear disguised as confidence? Netanyahu knows his base doesn't want nuance, they want defiance. And sometimes leaving things unsaid is the best way to keep the image clean. But history has a funny way of circling back. Those silences will come back to haunt him, maybe sooner than he thinks. Okay, so silence was one of his loudest tools, but you can't run a country on blank spaces forever. Which brings us to the next big fact. The future campaign card Netanyahu is already dealing from the bottom of the deck. Let's cut through the noise. Netanyahu's UN speech wasn't just foreign policy, it was a preview of his next election campaign. That's right, you were basically watching the trailer for Netanyahu, the sequel. And the theme? Simple. Fear. Think about it. He can't run on the economy, too shaky. He can't run on the war, too messy, too many questions. He can't even run on international diplomacy because, well, half the UN walked out on him. So what's left? Fear. The fear of being forced into a Palestinian state, the fear of global pressure crushing Israel, the fear of leaders too weak to protect the country. During his speech, he hammered the point. Over 90% of Israelis, he claimed, oppose a Palestinian state after October 7th. 90%. That's not just a stat, that's a campaign slogan. He's basically saying, look, it's not just me, it's all of you. I'm not extreme, I'm your voice. That's clever politics. He turns isolation into representation. And he framed it brilliantly. Only I can resist the world. Only I can say no. Only I can stop the bulldozer pushing us into a two-state trap. That's fear-based campaigning 101. Paint the alternatives as weakness. Frame yourself as the wall standing against the flood. But here's the thing about fear. It works fast, but it burns out. If you keep telling people the sky is falling, they'll rally at first. But after a while, if the sky hasn't fallen, they start looking up and asking questions. Fear campaigns are powerful, but they're also fragile. And yet Netanyahu knows this card well. He's played it for decades, and for decades, it's worked. Israelis who are tired, scared, or angry often default to the candidate who promises strength. Fear in this context isn't just an emotion, it's a political currency. Now let me put this to you. Do you think fear is a sustainable platform? Or do you think it eventually collapses when reality doesn't match the nightmare painted? Because here's the twist. If peace somehow comes, if Trump forces the war to end, Netanyahu loses his biggest campaign card. Without fear, what's left? That's why this speech mattered.
It wasn't just a global rant, it was a domestic rally cry, a sneak peek at how Netanyahu plans to frame the next election. Not on peace, not on prosperity, but on fear. And love him or hate him, you have to admit, that's a dangerous but effective play. So, we've seen the silence and we've seen the fear. But here's the real kicker. What happens when the speeches end, the campaigns fade, and reality hits? That's where the analysis gets very, very real.
Let's talk about the elephant in the room. Or should I say, the empty seats in the room. Because Netanyahu's UN speech highlighted something bigger than walkouts and protests. It highlighted Israel's growing isolation. But here's the twist. Netanyahu is turning that isolation into strategy. Think about it. Most leaders dread international pushback. Sanctions, embargoes, political cold shoulders. It's the stuff that keeps diplomats up at night. But Netanyahu? He's flipping the script. Instead of treating isolation as a problem, he's marketing it as proof. Proof that he's the only one willing to stand firm, the only one who won't bend, the only one tough enough to stare down the world and keep talking. And let's be real, this isn't a new tactic. Leaders throughout history have used enemies, real or exaggerated, to strengthen their image at home. The more critics you have abroad, the easier it is to say to your people, look, they hate me because I'm fighting for you. It's Politics 101. Turn external pressure into internal loyalty. But here's where it gets dangerous. Isolation comes with real costs. European tariffs threaten Israel's economy. Arms embargoes make it harder to replenish weapons. Tourism suffers, sports teams face bans, and the country risks being painted as a pariah on the world stage. That's not just symbolic, it's practical. It hurts everyday life. So the question becomes, how long can you spin isolation into strength before people start feeling the pain? At what point do Israelis stop seeing the world as haters and start wondering, wait, maybe we're losing ground? That's the balancing act Netanyahu is playing, and it's a razor's edge. And let me ask you, would you rather have a leader who compromises internationally to avoid sanctions, or one who says, forget the world, we'll survive alone? That's the tension every Israeli voter is wrestling with, whether they admit it or not. But for now, the political math works in his favor. The louder the world shouts, the easier it is for him to look like the underdog turned defender. And if you're building a campaign on fear and strength, nothing says they're all against us quite like an empty UN hall. All right, we've seen the defiance, the silence, the props, the fear and the isolation, but let's pull the curtain back one last time, because there's one final fact that tells us exactly what Netanyahu's long game really is. At the end of the day, Netanyahu's UN speech wasn't just about Gaza or Palestine or even the world. It was about something far more personal. His legacy. The man versus the moment. Think about it. He's been in power longer than almost any Israeli leader in history. He's weathered scandals, elections, protests, wars, and yet here he is again, standing at the UN, fiery as ever. But legacies aren't built on speeches. They're built on outcomes. And Netanyahu knows the clock is ticking. So what's the play? Simple. Carve himself into history not as the peacemaker, not as the compromiser, but as the defiant protector. The leader who said no when the world demanded yes. The man who turned isolation into resilience. The politician who made defiance his brand and dared to double down on it, even when it left him standing almost alone. But here's the catch. Legacies are tricky things. They're judged not by what you say in the moment, but what the future remembers. Will Netanyahu be remembered as the iron wall that defended Israel in its toughest days? Or will he be remembered as the man who stalled peace, deepened isolation, and gambled his country's place in the world for short-term political survival? That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, the answer isn't written yet. It depends on how this war ends. It depends on how Israel navigates the next election. It depends on whether fear-based politics holds or collapses. It depends on whether Israelis see him as savior or saboteur when the dust settles. Let me ask you, if you were writing the history books 50 years from now, how would you write Netanyahu's chapter? Would you call him a hero of resistance or the man who mistook stubbornness for strength? That's the choice Israel and history will have to make. So here's the big picture. Netanyahu's UN speech wasn't just a speech, it was theater. It was campaign, it was defiance wrapped in maps, props, and megaphones. Every fact we've broken down, empty halls, loudspeakers, silence, fear, isolation, legacy, all point to one thing: survival. Political survival at home, reputational survival abroad, and legacy survival in history. He's betting that speeches can outlast sanctions, that defiance can outshine diplomacy, that fear can outweigh fatigue. But bets are risky, and history has a way of cashing checks leaders can't afford. So, as the cameras fade and the headlines move on, remember this: Netanyahu didn't come to the UN to win the world. He came to win Israel, and whether that strategy succeeds or backfires spectacularly will shape not just his legacy, but Israel's future. Now it's your turn. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you see Netanyahu as the ultimate defender or the ultimate gambler? Is this legacy making or legacy breaking? And if you want more bold breakdowns of global flashpoints, hit subscribe, ring the bell, and join the conversation. Because this story, it's far from over.